Welcome to Families in Faith. This week, I want to give parents a broad brushstroke of biblical history so you can put the Bible stories that are popular in Sunday school lessons and children's Bibles into context. A lot of the stories are in the prehistory of Israel as a nation. In other words, the characters and events are leading up to the point where Israel becomes a nation. From creation and Adam and Eve to Noah, then to Abraham, where God first makes a covenant with Abraham to make him and his descendants into a great nation. From there we follow Abraham's family tree, Isaac to Jacob to Joseph into Egypt, where Jacob, who is now called Israel, and his family grow into a nation. This nation gets enslaved, which brings us to Moses and the Passover event. Now you have a nation of people wandering the desert for 40 years before entering the promised land. Once established in the land that God had promised them, Israel prospers, only to turn away from God and find hardship from other nations. Enter the era of judges. Every time Israel would turn away from God, they would be punished by conquering nations around them. Eventually, they would repent and turn back to God, when He would provide them with a judge to lead His people back to freedom. Stories include Deborah, Gideon, Samson, and Samuel. Samuel was the last judge, who would then usher in the era of kings. Israel pleaded with God for a king, just like the other nations around them. God warned them that kings would abuse their power, but they insisted, and God relented. So Samuel anointed the first king of Israel, Saul. The stories of kings include Saul, David, Solomon, and many others. There seems to be no pattern between those kings who loved God and followed His commands and those who fell away from God. One thing is clear, it happens a lot. And God eventually tears the nation of Israel into two parts, Israel and Judah. Here we enter the era of two kingdoms, which concludes with the exile of Israel to Babylon and Assyria. In exile, we get stories from Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Eventually, God's people repent, and Jerusalem and the temple are restored through Ezra and Nehemiah. This leads to the period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's about 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and when Jesus was born. Well, this broad look into the history of the Bible is to help parents see the big picture so they can put it into context with their children. Throughout it all, we learn of a loving God, working out the salvation of His people, even when they sin and fall away. Through Christ, we continue in that story today. We are people who sin and are in need of God's grace and forgiveness. And the story of God, who loves so much that He stopped at nothing to provide that forgiveness.